Good afternoon. I am Craig Hartman, the architect for Christ the Light Cathedral. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with you some of the thinking and ideas that went into the basic design concepts for the building that we see behind us here. This building, of course, is unlike any other, certainly like any other building I've had the opportunity to design as an architect. It's a building which will contain the great events of life: birth, life itself, death, and transformation, hopefully within its walls. So I appreciate that you have taken the time to learn more about the structure and about the metaphors and the basic design itself. So I hope that you'll find within the structure itself some inspiration, and I hope that it might be a part of your own lives, and I hope it can be of some enrichment to you and to your families. When I began work on this project, Bishop Cummins and subsequently Bishop Vigneron challenged me and my colleagues to conceive of a work of architecture that truly reflected our place in time, to make a cathedral that really reflected the cultural authenticity, if you will, of our place here on earth at this moment. And so this was a very provocative challenge, one that suggested a building that is very contemporary on one hand, and yet also a building which really respected 2,000 years of Catholic architectural history. Specifically, here we are in Oakland, a city of great cultural diversity and richness, perhaps one of the most multicultural cities on earth. Certainly nothing like the monoculture that existed when the great cathedrals that we think of in Rome, in Paris, in London. So looking at the site itself, of course, it is an extraordinary place. It is right at the northern tip of Lake Merritt, and it is a hinge, if you will, between the natural world and the urban world. And so we wanted to make this building oriented specifically to capture the length of Lake Merritt. So I felt if we could orient the building, and you'll see when you look at the building, is slightly twisted. It's turned in a way that that turns from the grid of the city to the natural realm and facing almost due south. This is a very, very important issue in the nuance of the site design itself. And then this idea of a culture that responded to the Pacific Rim. Certainly the beauty and the balance of the calligraphy, like this fish painting, suggests the fluidity that this building might take on. And this for me also was a very important, intuitive first step in thinking about the building, to try to find a way that the building might be, again, unlike the earlier cathedrals we know of, the ones that are very hierarchical and rigid and basilica form, to make a building that has a softness and fluidity. Now, very importantly, this also is a response to an idea that Vatican II embraces, and philosophers of the mid-century were endorsing this idea that perhaps the cathedrals of today could be ones that are more about community as opposed to a hierarchy. In other words, instead of having a long set of rows of pews with the priest at one end, to rather make a space that enveloped the altar, to make it a community about the altar in which everyone participated in a sharing way. So once we have these ideas, the intuitive notion about the fluidity, the programmatic idea about, and the liturgical idea about the relationship to the altar, the question was how to bring structure, if you will, geometric rigor to that idea. So we began to experiment with the idea of interlocking circles, and we found, to our great delight, is a shape that has fascinated mathematicians for many centuries. In fact, early mathematicians saw this as a sacred geometry, this shape that creates, again, the pointy ellipse, the Vesca Pisces, or the mandorla, is thought of as a transition or as a threshold of change between inside and outside, between entering one space and another. So this became a very powerful metaphor, and it became the founding principle of the geometry of the building itself. And we see the intersection again of the circles, the Vesca Pisces shape, as reflected in this recent photograph taken by the Hubble telescope of star nebula, again reflecting this same intersection and this same idea of the Vesca Pisces shape. And this, of course, we also see in the early Christian symbols that were used to indicate early secret places of meeting. So we've taken this idea and enlarged it and brought it into the actual geometry of the building itself. So here we're looking at a floor plan with the two reliquary walls that flank the sanctuary space. And you can see that within this, we have secondary geometries that are taken from the larger organizing geometry to locate, for example, the baptismal font at the main entry, the altar here at the other end of the main axis of the cathedral, and then following that same axis, another Vesica Pisces shape that contains the Eucharist and the tabernacle here at this location, and finally the Eucharist chapel itself at this end. So then the issue was, how can we bring this into the third dimension, just as the great cathedrals that we're so familiar with did, in which geometry became the overall defining structure, if you will, for the spaces themselves. So we made these three-dimensional spheres, as you see, which are made of circles of the exact same diameter you just saw in the plan, and bring these together and cut them in a way that begins to form, as you can see, a self-supporting structure, which results in the two spherical shapes, two spherical segments that form the sanctuary itself. And the idea taken further then was to embed these two spherical segments within two conical segments, and the two together then could be laced together to form a composite structure, a very lightweight but very rigid and very sturdy structure. So an intuitive idea here was to make this inner segment, segments of these spherical segments of wood, and to then encase these segments of wood within these conical segments of glass, creating two glass veils that become skin, if you will, of the structure. So here we are at a floor plan of the actual building as we have designed it, and your eye is drawn first to the altar, which we see here at the center and toward the front of the building. And we see that the altar itself is a circle and a square within it. So the idea of the square within the circle is a very powerful Asian symbol, the idea of heaven and earth brought together. Heaven is expressed in the circle and earth in the square. The square itself, the altar, is of white Carrara marble. This marble comes from the same quarry that Michelangelo, many centuries ago, quarried his stone for his sculptures. So this forms, of course, the very centroid of the building itself. And about this we have the congregation arrayed, the choir, and the clergy, all part of the same community. At the end of this, as we spoke earlier, we have the reliquary wall, and at this point on axis we have the Eucharist is held, and behind this the Eucharist chapel we see here in plan. So you'll notice right away that from the altar emanate a series of radial cuts, and these are side aisles that cut all the way through the reliquary wall itself. And this is a very, very important both physical and metaphorical point, because it connects the city through the wall to the altar. It also connects the lake directly through the wall and to the altar. So we brought the natural realm and the urban realm directly through, focused on the altar itself. And then, of course, the most important aisle is the one in the center, which connects the altar to the baptismal font, which we see here. Again, a circle, as you remember in plan in our early geometries. This baptismal font is directly on axis with the front door, the main doors, and the pilgrim's path, which is beyond in this drawing. As you recall from the early discussion about the site plan, the cathedral itself is turned. It is turned away from the main axis of the city to metaphorically bring it in alignment with the natural realm. So this long axis of the cathedral itself is on the long axis of the lake. So this allows us then another very interesting nuance, which is as a parishioner, as a visitor arrives at the cathedral, one comes first to the baptismal font, very important liturgically, and then you physically turn from the city to the axis of the sacred axis itself, the axis of the main altar. Finally, other nuances within the plan itself, you can see these cuts through the wall which reveal openings to reconciliation chapels, which are cut on the two sides here, directly adjacent. A very, very important connection to the water of the baptismal font. And then other chapels that are cut into the reliquary wall itself, which, as you know, are colored volumes within. These are meant to be very intimately scaled, smaller volumes within the larger volume of the cathedral itself. These are places of intimate worship and places that we think over the years various other various cultural nuances will take place within these spaces over time. We have taken great care then to bring together the city and this cathedral complex through the use of these gardens, which are open to all. The idea is to allow people to move through these gardens across the cathedral complex itself, up the Pilgrim's Pathway, down the civic stairway, connecting to the lake to make this very woven into the very, very fabric of the city of Oakland. We're looking at the components that make up the weave, if you will, of the wood and the glass. The wood comes from Oregon. You see it here being fabricated. This is, of course, a renewable material. It is, because it's so thick, it's called heavy timber, and it will not burn in a fire. It will actually char, and it's safer than steel in terms of its combustibility. So this is extremely good material to use for an important space like this. And of course, we know of temples in China, in Japan, that have been with us for 500 years or more, made of wood, although exposed to elements which this cathedral is not. You see the various structural components here, one of which is this vertical, or is the post, the compression piece that helps to knit together the veil wall and the exterior glass wall. And here we see the ribs being trucked to the site. These were the longest elements that could be trucked on our interstate highways. They're 110 feet long. They were then erected, as you can see, up against the Vesca Pisces tower scaffold form, which certainly was one of the more unusual moments in Oakland's history when this was floating above, free of the site. But you can see how the ribs connect to this, and when brought together, they form a compressive ring, which then are laced together with the exterior volume to create this very, very tensile, very, very rigid structure that's extremely lightweight. So here we see the wood struts and the steel tensile rods that tie it all together. And certainly one of the most rewarding pieces of this was when we were able to walk in and see that, yes, indeed, the light really does glow on this wood, so that we'll see times of the day when we see this very glowing quality, and other times of the day when it's very much in shade and shadow, always changing depending upon the nature of the time and season in which you experience the building itself. The glass itself is made up of layers that are adhesively brought together, laminated together. The inner layer is a very, very light translucent film, and then we have ceramic fritting, which creates this pattern that you can see on the outside of the building. And this is a very intentional geometric pattern that has a kind of it conveys the fact that it's made by man, and yet it has a kind of organic quality. And the importance here is that it creates a dappled quality of light within, and it through the translucency, it allows us to collect light on the backside and make a very luminous, ephemeral, always changing exterior veil, if you will, for the building itself. And just to show you briefly some of the process of design, we build with models. This is an early study model of the cathedral itself, looking at the side wall and looking inside the building. Looking here, you see again at the altar, the square altar within the circle. And the circle you can see opened again to bring light down with glass, in this case, down to the mausoleum below. And the cuts through the wall to the exterior itself, making that very strong connection. A view of the early view showing how we thought first of the oculus ceiling, and the way is shaped, as you can see, to bring light down specifically onto the omega wall. So at certain times, this light will rake the omega wall. This always, of course, is changing. It's never the same. So we looked at this. We carefully studied these elements in model form, as you see here, looking at the way that we can introduce perforations to make a sense of depth in the wall or in the oculus ceiling, at the same time bringing in direct light into the space itself and washing the altar, washing the omega wall, and then ultimately the pipe organ. Considering how we might bring within the building a representational image that is not stained glass. Stained glass, of course, in our earlier cathedrals were really pictograms. They were designed to convey biblical stories to the occupants of the building who were not literate. And today, of course, we have a different situation, and we know these stories, and we were able to read them. But the idea of having a representational image of Christ was a very important one that the bishop, Bishop Vigneron, was very um, interested in making sure this happened within the building. So we tried to find a way, our intentions were to find a way to make this happen while really making it part of the architecture. And the idea that you've seen now is to make a pixelization of an image of Christ projected through the architecture itself, through the diagrid that is the Omega wall. So the bishop selected for us the image that we should use in constructing this, and you can see that actually it comes from an early sculpture that's part of Chartres Cathedral on the west portal. And it is, over the years, it has been distressed and has lost some pieces, as you see here, a few digital pieces. But we have digitally reconstructed it we've obtained this image that digitally reconstructs the image. And then we have translated this to an algorithm using the computer to bits and bytes and then finally into pixels. And these pixels then are rayed through a variety of sized openings of small holes from 1/4 of an inch to 1 1/4 inches, 144 gradients, to give us a grayscale, if you will, that allowed us then to create an algorithm that recorded then the darks and the lights of this image. So through this, we were able to then create, as you see here, the beginning images of this figure. And as you stand farther away, of course, the figure becomes more clear. As you get closer, it dissolves into an abstraction of a dot pattern. So we did this by constructing a series of plan drawings first. You see these are prints actually made by our computer in our office, and we've printed these out at full size to see if we could begin to think that this was really going to work. We weren't sure. It was quite experimental. In fact, these algorithms had just been developed by us. We had never done this before. And once we became convinced that this could work, you can see the size of the square of the triangle here in this drawing, and you can see it in context here in the overall Omega wall. A typical triangular piece is 10 feet high and about 5 feet wide. So we then said, we think this will work. We made a large-scale mock-up in our office, used our laser cutter to actually construct a piece of this, cutting a piece of plastic. It was too big. We had to actually stick it up through the ceiling, as you can see in our office here. This is a conference room. But we stood back and saw it and became joyfully convinced that this was going to work. So we were confident enough at that point to invite Bishop Vigneron over and other members of the clergy, and we at that moment decided that yes, this will work, and let's make this the principal image within the building itself, within the cathedral sanctuary. So we proceeded. It was still quite an experiment, but you can see it today. So the day we arrived to look at some mock-ups, especially for the mega wall, was a beautiful day, but a bad day for viewing art. And the reason is that to look at the Omega wall, we have to see it with the bright light behind it, as you see it now in the sanctuary, and less bright light within on the face. So I warned the bishop and our colleagues walking in that this may not be the greatest viewing. And sure enough, we walked in and it was a disaster. You can see one of the diagrids here with Christ's face on it, and all it really is perceivable are these blobs. So this was an awkward moment. But the contractor said that that morning it had been much more effective, and the light looked beautiful, and suggested lifting up finding something to actually cast a shadow across the face. So we found a 12-ton dumpster, lifted up in the air, cast a shadow across the face, and sure enough, out of this emerged this extraordinary image of Christ. And so, as you can see within the building itself, this experiment turned into one of the perhaps most extraordinary parts of the cathedral itself. So thank you for sitting through this somewhat long explanation of the ideas within this building. I hope that now some of the ideas, which may be somewhat obscure to the casual observer, are now very much a part of your understanding of the structure. So again, thank you, and I hope that this experience and the experience of using this cathedral will be a source of richness in your life.